مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. ربما فقط سوف يستمتع جو بايدن أخيرا بانتصارين سياسيين: موافقة الكونغرس على خطتي إنفاق هائلتين تشكلان محور جدول أعماله المحلي. إحداهما هي إنفاق تريليون دولار على إصلاح الطرق والجسور والقطارات والمطارات في أمريكا، ومن بين هذا المبلغ حوالي تريليون ونصف تريليون دولار لمحاربة تغير المناخ وتعزيز التعليم ودعم الرعاية الصحية لكبار السن الأمريكيين. إذا وافق الكونغرس على هاتين الخطتين فهذا سيشكل أكبر زيادة في دعم نظام الرعاية الاجتماعية في أمريكا منذ أكثر من 50 عاما. أو ربما قد لا يحصل ذلك. قد يكون السبب أيضا لكون الديمقراطيين يسيطرون على مجلس الشيوخ بفارق صوت واحد فقط، ولأن مجموعة من اليساريين التقدميين في مجلس النواب تريد إنفاقا اجتماعيا أكثر مما يريده اثنان من أعضاء كتلة الوسط المعتدل في مجلس الشيوخ. إذا لم يوافق الكونغرس على هذه الاقتراحات فستكون تلك هزيمة كبيرة للإدارة. ماذا تتضمن هذه الاقتراحات؟ هل سيوافق الكونغرس عليها أم هل سيعاني جو بايدن من هزيمة مذلة؟ لمناقشة الأمور السياسية والاقتصادية التي يتضمنها جدول أعمال إدارة بايدن المحلي، يسعدني أن أرحب بجيمس أستيل وبيانكا فاشيني. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. After a drubbing in off-year elections, the Democratic Party faces a choice. Will they finally get their act together and pass major legislation that is the centerpiece of the Biden administration's domestic policy? Or will they have the reputation of do-nothings, setting the stage for what could be a Republican huge tidal wave victory a year from now? Let's take a look at what the Democrats are considering and whether, in fact, it may stem the tide of this potential Republican victory. James Astil, Bianca Fascini, thank you very much for joining us this morning. So, James, what are the two pieces of legislation that Democrats have been fighting over for months, putting aside Republican opposition?
They're worth talking through, Rob, so I'll do that painstakingly because they're slightly different in character. One piece of legislation which would spend about $1 trillion on reconstructing and updating America's creaking physical infrastructure, roads, bridges, old-fashioned stuff like that. And that includes about $550 billion of additional spending, new spending. So it's a significant update, potentially. House Democrats have refused to pass that legislation effectively, sending it on to the president's desk, until they can also get agreement on this separate bill that you refer to. That separate bill is one that Democrats need almost unanimous Democratic support to pass because Republicans are not interested in it. That is a bill which is essentially addressed to two things: expanding the safety net, the welfare system, social security system, healthcare system, and spending in the federal government terms an unprecedented sum on climate change policy. That bill amounts to about $1.75 trillion of new spending, which would be paid for by raising taxes in rather fiddly ways on businesses and the very wealthy. And of that 1.75 trillion, about $500 billion would go on climate policy, about $500 billion would go on childcare and pre-K schooling, something that America is very ungenerous on currently compared to all its developed world peers. And then the additional sort of $750 billion would go on a sort of smorgasbord of different social policies.
All right. So when you add it all up, we're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of approaching $3 trillion worth of spending. This isn't nearly as much as some people wanted, although it's quite a lot of money. Bianca, and why isn't it even bigger than this?
I wish I had a simple way of answering that question. I don't know how much time we have today, but I think, the interesting thing here is that a lot of the issues that are in the Build Back Better agenda have for a long time polled well, but the Build Back Better agenda itself is full of so many different things. When you look at previous first-term presidencies, during President Obama, it was healthcare. During President Trump's first term, it was taxes. Obviously, the world is so different after the pandemic, but the Build Back Better agenda is not just one particular issue. So instead of having to fight with Republicans over one issue, like the Obama administration had to fight over healthcare, Trump had to fight with the Democrats over taxes, the Biden administration has to fight with Republicans and members of his own party over several different issues. Right now, the key one with Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kristen Sinema is the paid leave part of the Build Back Better agenda. They can't seem to agree on how to move forward with that. So it's not just one major issue that they're fighting over, it's several issues. But right now, there are so many conflicts within the Democratic Party on top of the traditional conflicts between the Democrats and Republicans.
Let me ask you, Bianca, when you talk to people in the wake of what seems to be a Republican victory on this off-year election, because the Republicans won in Virginia, turning around a Democratic victory previously, and almost won in New Jersey. What is the big takeaway for Democrats? Do they feel as though they need to be more progressive? Do they feel as though they need to be less progressive to appeal to moderate voters? What's the emerging consensus?
I think the emerging consensus is that there was not enough unity on how to move forward out of the pandemic, because Republicans really jumped in a variety of different races, whether you're looking at Virginia or New Jersey or at the local and state level. They really had a clear message about what they were, fighting against, education, critical race theory, things like that. They really jumped on those issues, but Democrats were not united. And I think part of that is because they have been having trouble in Washington getting this Build Back Better agenda moving forward. I do think it is important to point out, and this has been pointed out before, it's not a unique thought, but during the first term of every presidency, it's at this point expected that the opposing party is going to make gains in the midterms. This happened in 2010 during President Obama's first term. It also happened in 2018 during President Trump's first term. Like you said, though, this is an off-year election. We're not at the midterms yet. So, and in New Jersey, it was very shocking that Governor Phil Murphy almost was not reelected. Obviously, in Virginia, we're talking about a state that for a long time was a swing state. It obviously had been blue more recently, but the fact that a Republican governor won was somewhat of a surprise, because President Biden said he was pretty confident that they would take Virginia. So I think the Democratic Party has a lot of self-reflection that they need to do right now before they head to the midterms, which, are pretty much here. It's almost Christmas, right? Time is ticking. So they have a lot of things that they need to sort out before all of their candidates get on the campaign trail.
And James, what are you hearing in terms of an emerging consensus among Democrats? Move to the left, move to the center, or just, damn it, get things done?
I think it's the last of those, Rob. I disagree marginally with what Bianca just said, because I think that there is extraordinary agreement amongst Democrats about what is, by recent standards, a pretty radical, certainly a very profligate agenda. There is basic agreement between the left of the party and the centre of the party on all of this stuff, all of that spending, and indeed the centre of the party, by and large, wanted a much bigger spending package. The reason that the package has been slimmed and the reason it's not passed is because of opposition from just a couple of senators. A couple of House members aren't sure either. But basically, it's just two Democratic senators who have enormous power because the Democrats can't afford to drop a single vote in the Senate on this matter. I think the Democrats have played the politics of this abysmally, and I think that is the recognition. It's your last point. They just need to get moving on this now. They need to be seen to get moving, and they need to explain to the country what it is they're trying to do. Democrats are so locked in their sort of intra-party debates that they forget that they actually have to explain to Americans what the objective is in a clear way that busy people can hope to sort of take in on their way to work, briefly listening to the radio in the car between getting their coffee and driving in. Democrats are useless at that basic messaging, basic explanation to the country, the politics of what they're trying to do. On the policy, I think they're doing maybe a little better than Bianca does.
So actually, let me just pursue this for a moment. Bianca, let me ask you. So some say that these bills, I think James hinted at it earlier, that if passed, these bills would amount to the greatest expansion of the social welfare net in America in more than 50 years since the Great Society of the 1960s. Is that an argument that will appeal to people or will scare away people?
Well, that's a good question. I think that's something that appeals, but I think the message needs to be a little more specific, because it's very clear right now, especially post-pandemic, that millions of Americans are struggling. The pandemic, for the wealthiest Americans, it didn't affect them in ways that it hit middle income and low income Americans. So the idea of having something like paid leave available and universal pre-K available are things that pull well with Americans. And I think the fact that there is unity among Democrats, but their message hasn't been clear enough. So I think if they can figure out a way to be more unified on the message to voters, especially ahead of the midterms, they could have a better chance of making this appeal to people.
All right. When we come back after the break, I'm going to ask you about that I word that you mentioned and whether the Democrats are going to have an albatross around their neck with a rise in inflation in just a moment. I am part of the generation that reads news the old-fashioned way, in print. I get the newspaper every morning. And one of the benefits of getting a newspaper is that I can turn to the last page of the first section and enjoy the surprise of seeing my favorite columnists on the editorial page. Some have political views I agree with. Some use humor to explain away the political tragedy in our country today. But none have the erudition, the language, syntax, argument, and reasoning of George Will, an editorial machine who turned 80 this year. Will is an old-fashioned conservative, a powerful critic of Donald Trump, and a champion of traditional conservative reverence for tradition, precedent, and history. I don't always agree with him, but I read every column he writes with relish, which is why I recommend his latest book, titled American Happiness and Discontents. Take Will in small 800-word doses, or take him in one big book-length dose, but to understand a side of America you won't find on cable TV, make sure you find a way to read him. Again, my guests today include Bianca Fascini. Bianca is Washington-based economics correspondent for The Newsy, a digital news outlet targeting Zennials, Millennials, and Gen Z, or the TikTok generation. I don't understand what I just said. She also covered politics and Capitol Hill. Also joining us is James Astill. James is the Washington bureau chief and Lexington columnist at The Economist. Previously, he served as The Economist's South Asia bureau chief based in Delhi, was the energy and environment editor and the political editor. And to his great credit, James is the author of an award-winning book on India and cricket. Okay, James, not India, but the other I word, inflation. We're at 5.4% now. Will the passage of these bills likely fuel additional inflation? And more to the point of this show, what are the political implications of additional inflation, especially for the Democrats?
Well, they shouldn't. The passage of the bill shouldn't fuel inflation. They're paid for, and there is, on the one hand, there's something of a consensus amongst economists that they wouldn't be inflationary, and on the other hand, we should be aware that economists tend not to understand inflation very well. What I would say, sort of slightly skirting that question and getting to your second one, is that if we do see persistent high inflation, even as growth has been flagging over the last couple of months, it fell from around 6% to 2% in the last quarter because of supply glitches, because of the resurgence of COVID-19, we think, then there is a serious political problem. There's an economic problem and there's a serious political problem for the Democrats, because even before inflation was perceived to be a problem at that level, at that sort of 5% level, there was a political message out there that people were struggling, which people were responsive to, because I think they're grumbly about the pandemic, they're nervous about the post-pandemic economy.
Are Republican successes in this off-year election likely to re-energize young people who voted to get rid of Donald Trump in 2020, or is it going to be depressing? And are we likely to see many of them just stay home in 2022?
I mean, I think the midterm elections during a first term of a president are always pretty energetic among most voters. So I think we should definitely expect that energy. I also, again, like I was saying earlier in our conversation, it's very much expected for the opposing party to make gains. But I do think it's Republicans have a very fine line to walk when they're out campaigning during the midterms or ahead of the midterms, when it comes to former President Trump, because obviously President Biden beat him during a time of incredible instability for so many Americans, and he clearly emerged the victor. And President Trump was incredibly divisive among many Republican voters, especially the young Republican voters that just could not get on board with him for a variety of reasons. So I think they can't shut out the Trump base, but I mean, look at what happened in Virginia. The college educated, women went back to Youngkin after running from the Republicans because of what they saw with President Trump. So they have, a lot of work to do there in terms of making all factions of the party happy with their main core values and issues moving forward. But we also have to think about who will be voting in 2020. And millennials are obviously getting older now. So the issues that might appeal to millennials are a bit different than I think they were over the past few first-term, midterm elections. And then, of course, baby boomers are also getting older. So the issues for them are going to change as well. So I think that Republicans are heading into midterms knowing that they had a lot of success this past week. That's a good sign for them, but a lot can happen in a year. So I would caution anyone to make too many predictions about what could happen next November.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. And I fully reject the notion that baby boomers are getting older. By the way.
They're not old. They're just getting older, as are millennials.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you.
I have been making up for lost time. Over the last 3 months, I have traveled to 3 continents, visiting Guatemala and Dominican Republic in South America, Italy in Europe, and Jordan, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates in Asia. Next month, I add another continent to these travels with a visit to Morocco in North Africa. Meanwhile, I've done quite a bit of traveling here in the United States too, flying to Boston and Charleston and St. Louis, plus a train trip to New York. All told, it's a lot of travel. Along the way, I have seen countries, states, counties, and cities adopt a wide variety of strategies against COVID-19. In Israel, there's just one set of rules for the entire country. In the Emirates, there are different rules in each emirate. In the United States, there are thousands of different jurisdictions, and it seems as though each has its own rules for masks, vaccinations, and quarantines. And then there are the exceptions to the rules you see everywhere, such as what happens at Dulles Airport, which routinely flouts social distancing rules by stuffing travelers like sardines into its interterminal trains and those crazy buses that take people from the landing gate to the arrival zone. What's been especially interesting to me is the socializing of protection against COVID. Who wears masks by choice, not by rule, because they want to minimize their risk? And who is flocking to indoor bars, restaurants, and other tight social confines despite the risk? I saw kids playing baseball in masks in an out-of-the-way Dominican Republic town. I saw conductors enforce masking rules on an otherwise empty Italian train. I even had a nurse come to my Tel Aviv hotel room at 1 a.m. in the morning to take my blood and then go directly to test it at a hospital so I could shorten the time I spent in quarantine. Through it all, I have come to appreciate the resilience, flexibility, and good humor of most people I met around the world. COVID can test your sanity. Being stuck sitting next to a repeat violator of COVID rules, such as someone who sits maskless for an hour as they sip a soda on a plane, for example, that can be maddening. And I have read dozens of stories of violence on airplanes by people frustrated by the rules. I'm sure it happens, but I have never seen it. What do I take away from all this? I have seen the destruction that COVID can cause. As viewers of this show know, my mother died from complications of COVID, after all, one of about 5 million victims around the world. But after seeing the remarkable global get-together of Dubai Expo, after seeing people from around the world marvel at the artistic gems in Florence, after seeing Times Square filled with revelers on a recent Saturday night, I remain optimistic. We will prevail. Yes, we've made just about all the mistakes and misjudgments one could imagine, especially by allowing our domestic political tribalism to get in the way of sound medical and scientific judgment. But even so, we have learned that life goes on. Birthdays and weddings, not just funerals and memorials. Around the world, we aren't letting a mask get in the way of living. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات وخاصة حول العلاقات المضطربة بين التقدميين والمعتدلين في الحزب الديمقراطي، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر @InsideWashington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.